Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. Today I'm going to be talking about multiple approaches to astrological remediation. And astrological remediation is basically using, usually it's talismans, but other magical means or other methodologies to deal with life problems as shown in the natal chart. It's really a fad right now, and it's gotten big. If I'm talking about it, it's a bit like when something pop comes up in the New York Times. I'm so isolated, but if I've had multiple people asking me about it and multiple things coming up about it, then I know it's time for me to do a video. So, there really is a standard approach to it. I see, you look out, and people argue about things, but the underlying approach and the underlying assumptions really are the same pretty much across everybody who's talking about astrological remediation these days. What I want to do is to talk about the standard approach, see if we can get in and analyze it on a deep level, and then talk about possible alternatives. And right from the get-go, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that my method is right and everybody else is wrong. I just want to kind of get into it, explain things on a kind of deeper level. You can see which approach resonates with you, and then you can go with it. And obviously, I prefer my method, but it's on the level of I prefer vanilla over chocolate. Again, I don't want to be saying that there's a right or wrong to this, but I do think it's interesting to analyze the underlying assumptions that inform people's choices about the approach they take, and then to get a better idea of the fact that there are alternatives. Even though there's just one standard approach, as kind of everybody's putting out there, there are alternatives to that, and there are other ways to go about this. So let me just kind of lay out what I see as the sort of basic components of the standard view of astrological remediation. What's come together? How's it done? And what's kind of underlying it. So the first is that when we're dealing with this, it comes from a natal chart focus. Okay. The second is that their life problems are easily diagnosed in the natal chart. Okay. The third assumption is that the planets or the stars or whatever you're looking at, mostly planets, that are indicating problems in the natal chart are themselves the source of the problem. Okay. And number four, if you, by directly doing something to the planet that's causing the problem, which we can see from the natal chart, we can easily solve the life problem. Okay, then 5, talismans and other magical means are so powerful they can easily solve life problems once you diagnose them from the natal chart. So again, this is sort of everybody's approach that they're coming into. And like I said, I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive into it. So let's start with the first one, the natal chart focus. This is pretty much natural and automatic to anybody who's doing astrology, in 2024. Coming out of a modern natal approach, for most people, natal astrology is astrology, and psychological astrology is the only way to go about it. This is the predominant form. This is what everybody's used to. And so even if people are, trying to do something other than natal charts, they're using natal chart techniques, and they're using the assumptions that come with the natal chart. Not unreasonable, but again, not the only possible approach. And another way to look at it, if you look at the medieval Renaissance astrology, is to see that there really is a big difference between natal and horary techniques. Now, so for example, in a medieval Renaissance delineation, if you're looking at the natal chart, you can look at the entire chart, just like you would in modern astrology. Everything's got a meaning, everything's important. It's all, sort of pieces in terms of looking at the life of the person whose chart you're looking at. Horary and electional are very different from this. When you have a horary electional chart, you're only looking at very specific parts of that chart. Only specific pieces of it are really important, and you're not going all over the chart. So that's a very significant difference in the approach and how you're looking at things. I mean, another example is the difference between applying and separating aspects. In modern natal and Renaissance astrology, natal, medieval Renaissance, there really isn't much of a difference in the natal between applying and separating. If it's a square, it's a square. If it's trine, it's a trine. Doesn't really matter. If, however, you're doing horary or electional astrology, then separating versus applying aspects make a huge difference. A separating aspect is going to show you things that happened in the past or things that are ineffective unless you're trying to get rid of something. An applying aspect is going to show current or future events. It's also going to show that things are effective if you're trying to bring them about. So again, big difference between natal and horary and electional. And so for medieval Renaissance astrology, you're going to recognize that there's the natal technique and natal chart approach is not the be-all and end-all of astrology, that there are other ways to go about it. So next, let's think about, just in terms of the idea of diagnosis, and prediction. So if in a modern approach we're to look at the natal chart and see Saturn in the seventh, a typical response to that would say, okay, you've got problems with relationships. I mean, Saturn's malefic or Saturn's bad if you accept that at all. At least it shows problems. We don't like to talk about malefic in modern. But Saturn in the seventh could well show that you have relationship problems. Very straightforward. In medieval Renaissance, we would take a more nuanced approach. First thing we look at would be what's Saturn's essential and accidental dignity. So for example, if Saturn is highly dignified, say by sign in the seventh, that actually probably on balance would be helpful with relationships. On the other hand, Saturn in detriment, thus highly afflicted, that would be an indication of relationship problems. And this, if you had Saturn dignified by sign and combust, so you have a combination of mixed dignity and debility, that would show both pluses and minuses for relationships. The other thing that's maybe a more subtle point, but was definitely true, is that we wouldn't just be looking at a single factor. We wouldn't just have one thing jump out of us and make our delineation based on that one factor. What we'd be doing is looking at a whole variety of different factors. Again, relationships, typically we can look at the ruler of the house. I mean, the house ruler for everything is planets in the house. Again, in modern astrology, if there's no planets in the house, people are saying, what do I do? There's no planets in the house. You look at the ruler. You also have natural rulership. And so there's that's going on as well, aspects that are being made. You have multiple factors that you're looking at. And so this is something that you're going to make a delineation in a medieval Renaissance setting on the natal seventh house for relationships from looking at multiple factors. And so, again, a different approach. Again, you may be able to get accurate results from the modern approach, but there's also an alternative to that. So the next step is, okay, so we're looking at these factors, we're making this prediction or whatever. What is the underlying causality? What's the connection between Saturn and the native, that's the person whose natal chart is looking at, that allows us to predict? So again, the automatic standard approach in modern astrology is that Saturn himself is the source of the problem. Okay, Saturn's in the seventh house. He must be beaming some kind of energy. He must be messing you up in some way. Like I said, energy is probably rays, something like that. It has to be that. I mean, there's no other possible causality. So even if it's not magnetism or like electromagnetic rays, it's spiritual rays. And so you've got Saturn messing you up. That's the cause of the problem. And then what the remediation does is to deal with Saturn. We go directly to the root of the problem, which is Saturn messing you up, and then we do something with Saturn. We stop the rays, we block it, we do something with Saturn, we deal with Saturn, some way, shape, or form, and we stop Saturn from messing us up. And so this idea that the planets are direct causes, it's certainly there as a strand of medieval Renaissance astrology, but there's other alternatives that are available as well. And the idea that the stars are messengers is something that really has a long pedigree. I mean, for example, Plotinus, who's a 3rd century Neoplatonic philosopher, he has a whole Aeneid called Are the Stars Causes? And his answer basically is no. And what Plotinus says is, he says, we may think of the stars as letters perpetually being inscribed on the heavens. And they have their own thing that they're doing, but they signify as well. And the reason that they signify is because the cosmos is one great unity. And so again, it's a lot like if you have yellow skin, you say, oh, you have jaundice. I mean, the yellow skin's not causing the jaundice, it's just signifying it. And so, because everything's connected, because everything's a unity, we can read what's happening in one area to indicate what's happening in another. So again, you can look at this and say the cycles of the heavens, the cycles of the stars and planets reflect the underlying spiritual cycles that govern affairs on Earth. So the bottom line with this view is that Saturn is not actively causing relationship problems. He's not beaming bad energy. He's a messenger. Okay? And so the planets themselves are not the causes. They're just reflecting these underlying cycles as well. And so if you have that approach that stars and planets are messengers, then trying to directly deal with their natal influence is about as fruitless as turning your phone off in the hopes that you're not going to get a text with bad news, and that's going to get rid of the bad news. It won't happen. If I don't hear it, then nothing's going to happen. So, killing the messenger is psychologically understandable, but it's not effective in practical terms if that's what's going on and the underlying thing. So again, you got to figure out which resonates with you and what makes sense. So then the next step is, okay, so with the standard approach, once we've identified the problem, um, you know, do talismans cause quick, deep, and lasting change? And I think the standard answer is yes. That these are so all-powerful, either for good or ill, that they can very quickly solve any kind of problem that they come up against. And you know, I think that's very flattering to the astrological magic practitioner. I mean, oh, you're the great and powerful mage. It's also good for selling talismans. Appeals to the customer too. I think you'd like the idea of just buy a talisman and you'll be an instant billionaire. Your lifelong depression disappears. Your Prince Charming appears in a week, and all your problems are effortlessly solved. The flip side, though, with that is that the slightest mistake, and I hear this, the slightest mistake in the election, in making the talisman or using the talisman is instantly deadly. You know, and you've got the situation where people, you know, maybe they're unconscious of their own neuroses or whatever, and they're infecting people with it, or they're using it as a conscious tool to kind of manipulate people to freak them out. So again, I mean, my personal view is that I don't think talismans are that all powerful. I think they work, but they're not just super strong or immediately effective, particularly if you're trying to get a specific effect, whether that's positive or negative. Now, I don't want to go the other extreme of the skeptic and say, oh, it doesn't work at all. But I think you have to have a realistic view of what the power of the talisman actually is. So what's the other alternative? If you're saying, well, that the planets are predictive and they're not the ones directly causing it, and the talismans aren't going to superly solve your problems. I think what you start with is this idea that, I mean, first of all, you don't even have to look at the natal chart. I mean, in terms of what your problems are. I mean, you know what your problems are. If you say, I need money, then you can go ahead and just get a wealth talisman right off the bat. There's no necessity of immediately looking at the chart to figure out what your problems are. The other thing I would say about it is that figuring out the causality, and like I said, I lost my job, so now what? It's very difficult to do, And what people are really hoping for is they can get, the simple answer quickly from astrology that's going to lay out what the problem is. My experience is it's much more deeply rooted. You've got a lot of stuff going on. You got your personal problems. You got the problems of the economy, your family, the country, whatever. A lot of stuff going on. And it may not. I mean, I had a situation when early on, I worked for the government, and I basically got fired, and I just thought it was terrible. I realize now that I hated that job. I didn't want to quit, and thank God I did get fired because it set me off on a whole different career track. So again, what I thought at the moment was terrible wasn't actually that. There was actually a purpose to it. It was all part of the plan. So again, lots of different things you can juggle around in here. But the approach that I tend to take is that someone comes in and says, I've got a particular problem. I mean, you can look at the natal chart. But if you said I've got a love problem, or you look at the natal chart and you can see problems with the 7th house or with, that are indicating relationships, then what I'm going to do is say, okay, if you've got a relationship problem, let's look at a talisman in terms of using talismans. Let's look at a talisman that helps with love. And they help with love through their natural rulership, the things they naturally rule through the natural effects of that planet, star, or whatever you're dealing with. So for example, for love, Venus would be the obvious choice of planets. The 26th mansion is a mansion of the moon that's very good for love, and then Andromeda is a constellation that's excellent for love. It's basically referred to as a super love talisman. So that would be my approach in terms of how I'd be doing suggestions. Then in terms of, you could check them against the natal chart, and I've got a whole nother video about that, about choosing talismans. You can check that out. But I'm not going to be automatically looking for the first thing at the natal chart to tell me because people come to me and they say, what's the best talisman for me? As if it's like asking what's the best vacation for me. It's like, what do you want to do? Do you want to have adventure travel? Do you want to lay on the beach? Do you want to sightsee? It's going to depend on what the effects are, what the goals are, is what's going to be the best talisman for you, is typically my approach. I'm perfectly happy to choose a talisman intuitively for people if you want to do that, but I don't see any way to look at the chart and say right off the bat what's the best talisman for you without any idea what the goals are. So the other thing I would say about it is that the talisman by itself, in my view, is not going to solve the problem. I mean, when people come to me and they say, I have a friend who's got terminal cancer, what talisman should I buy for them? I'm very leery about selling them a talisman at all, because I think that's giving this promise that somehow the talisman is going to cure the situation. And I just don't think that's going to be true with a really serious illness or a serious life problem. I mean, if you've got massive depression, to say to somebody, oh, get this talisman, it's going to solve your problem, I just don't go along with it. Now, if you've got a practical plan in place, for example, if if you're looking for wealth and you've got this whole business plan, you're setting up your website, you've got everything going on, and you want to add to that, you want to maximize that, I think it totally makes sense to have a talisman. But it's just not going to work by itself. It's not going to work instantaneously. And the effects, really kind of uncertain. I see talismans much more as reality warping. I mean, a good example I would say with talismans that's sort of analogous is if you think about blackjack, the odds against you in a really good casino are 1%. And with that 1% advantage, the casino can win all your money. If you count cards, if you keep track of the odds that way, you can gain a 1% advantage, and the casino is going to throw you out. If they catch you counting cards, they're going to toss you out. That's too much of an advantage. Now, most people would just sort of poo-poo a 1% advantage. What's the point? In the right hands, in the right circumstances, that 1% advantage can be highly, highly effective. And that's what I would say about talismans, is that they have that reality warping aspect. Now, the other things that they'll do is that you can get some really amazing results, but they tend to be unpredictable. And so that's I think on the flip side of it is that, ultimately, when I'm looking at talismans, I'm coming at it from a devotional approach. And what I'm doing is saying, I want to develop a long-term relationship with the angel of the talisman, and I really see that as very transformative. I mean, if you want love and you're focused on, I want this particular person back, trying to do that magically, I think, is going to be very difficult. I highly doubt buying a talisman is going to get a specific person for you. If you broaden that and say, bring me love, they give a much better chance of getting it. But if you broaden it even further and say, rather than saying, I'm going to transform the outside world to conform to my wishes, if you allow the relationship with the spirit and the angel of the talisman to transform you, again, like with Venus, to make you a more loving person, more open to love, then I think that's a much more fruitful approach. And again, typical results of a Venus talisman that people report to me are things like, I was much more easygoing in social circumstances. I had a lot of fun when I was out. People that I was attracted to were attracted to me. Even people that like old girlfriends or boyfriends that were calling me on the phone or whatever. Things like that. The more psychological and spiritual effects, because this is a spiritual manifestation, I think those are more likely to happen. So again, I think that, it's this idea, again, that you can really easily figure out what the problems are from the natal chart. In fact, you start with the natal chart, it lays out the problem, and then you just deal with the planets causing the problem, and it's easily done with talismans. I'm skeptical of that as an approach. I think it's going to continually be the most popular way that people go about it. Again, I don't want to say it's wrong, but I want to point out to people, if you're having misgivings about that, or if you've tried it and it hasn't really worked out for you, there are alternative approaches to it. And like I said, I'd prefer to take a more devotional approach, which is a more long-term. It's also just being open to what the situation is going to give to you. The other thing I would say about sort of like personality problems or life things like that is that I know for myself, I've spent many years in my spiritual quest trying to work on the fact that I tend to be very touchy and get angry about stuff. And I think I'm better than I used to be, but I don't feel like I'm ever going to entirely be free of it. For as much work as I've done on it, it's been worthwhile to do it. But it was certainly not something I could just, snap a finger and that's going to be solved. And that's the tendency I have. I don't want to say, oh, it's hopeless, that you can't solve your problems, but I also want to be realistic about it and say, how much change is possible. And we can't really expect to bewitch, wiggle our nose and then everything's going to be taken care of. And so that's what I would say about it, is that I think that looking at the causality, looking at what's going on, it's very useful to understand the underlying process. So I hope you find that interesting. Again, I don't want to say that my view is the only correct view. There's lots of ways of going about this. I think, again, if the standard approach resonates for you and that works for you, I mean, if you're able to get instant miraculous results and solve your life problems, that's wonderful. If you try it and that approach is not working out, I'd hate to have people just say, oh, everything, doesn't work with it. Look into the devotional approach. Take a look at my book, The Celestial Way. There's a link to that. You can see some of the other devotional practices like planetary charity. But also, again, I'd be happy to, make suggestions if you're interested in talismans. You just want to come at it from a realistic standpoint. recognize that you don't know what's going to happen, and just be open to allowing your life to be unfolded and transformed by the celestial spirits. I've certainly found it to be really transformative in my life. I attribute a lot of my success to astrological magic I've done, but I've also a lot of it is being open and willing to see what the spirits and the angels have guided me to. So I hope you find that interesting, and I hope you find an approach among these various approaches that are laid out for you that resonates for you.